Liberia, the birth pains of a nation. On July 26, 1847, a nation was born on the west coast of Africa that was far different from other nations. After Haiti, Liberia was the only other nation on earth to be administered solely by black people who had recently been in bondage. The Africans in Haiti had violently reclaimed their freedom from their slave masters. They chose to make their home in a land that thrived on their blood and tears, far across the oceans from where their roots were planted. Those returning to pursue their destiny in Africa did so because their freedom had become a source of worry for the people who had enslaved them. The slave masters in North America were afraid that what had happened in Haiti may also visit their shores. They therefore encouraged the Africans to go home to the very coast from where they had loaded their ancestors onto ships and chains about 3 centuries before to feed the white man's insatiable greed. Yet this was not an empty space. People already lived here who were ready to fight for every inch of their land. How do the aspirations of the two peoples intertwine to give birth to a nation? The descendants of the Africans who had been violently ripped from their roots must now reassert their claim to freedom over the offsprings of the very people who had sold them off to strange lands. Unfortunately, there was no welcome party to celebrate their return. There was no sense of guilt for the evil committed against their forefathers. Only mutual suspicion hung in the air. The trade in human blood had not ceased. From generation to generation, it had become a way of life, refined and passed down. Those who came and those they met here were total strangers to one another in body, mind, and soul. One group was seen as imposters, here only to disrupt the fine balance of life for the indigenous. The others were savages and heathens who needed to be tamed and schooled in the ways of the white man, called civilization. From the day the returnees set foot on Providence Island, sketches of battle lines were already emerging in the sand. Declaring independence as a sovereign nation was a desperate attempt by Liberia to forestall encroachment on its territory by Britain and France. The United States government had contributed to the efforts of the American Colonization Society to secure a settlement for free slaves who it was eager to dispose of. With its lackluster approach to the settlement, it was evident that the USA did not see much value in it to fight for, especially against former adversaries like Britain and France. These two leading European powers took advantage of this cold-shoulder diplomacy to annex territories that should have belonged to Liberia at all of its land-based frontiers in today's Ivory Coast, Guinea, and Sierra Leone. The first piece of land that formed the foundation of this new nation was only 140 acres. The documentary, The Birth Pain of a Nation, will attempt to provide a glimpse into some of the struggles the settlement had to endure to grow from 140 acres to its current size of 27 million acres, or 43,000 square miles. The vision for the establishment of Liberia did not begin in Africa. It began far away, across the Atlantic Oceans, in the United States of America. It was an experiment that nearly failed at its inception, because it was conducted by a group of people perceived by the tribal communities living here as alien implants who not only lacked an understanding of their ways of life, but also disparaged them. The institution of slavery that once so smoothly ran on the blood and sweat of enslaved Africans, without question, was beginning to wobble under scrutiny. It no longer enjoyed universal endorsement among the white population. An increasing number of freed slaves and freeborn Africans seemed menacing to the slave owners. There were multiple interest groups with varying agenda, but they all shared the belief that black and white people could not coexist as equals in the USA. Old political enemies collaborated through the American Colonization Society to repatriate the Africans back to Africa. Many slave owners feared free black populations would encourage enslaved people to rebel or escape. Abolitionists and humanitarian groups believed Black Americans would face fewer obstacles to freedom and prosperity in Africa than in the racially hostile USA. Some other supporters of repatriation viewed the colony as a base for spreading Christianity and Western civilization across the African continent. By the close of the 17th century, repatriating slave descendants back to Africa was no longer a theoretical subject. The British had taken the lead in that and shown that it was feasible. They had established the colony of Sierra Leone, where they had settled about 1,000 repatriated Africans from mainland UK and Jamaica. It was only a matter of time before the idea took root in the United States of America. While America discussed the issue in 1815, a man named Paul Cuffey convinced a group of 9 families, about 38 black persons who could no longer bear racial mistreatment in America, to blaze the trail for their kindred. He personally sponsored the voyage. It was not surprising that he took the returnees to Chebro Island, at the mouth of the Chebro River, on the coast of West Africa, adjacent to the British colony. Paul Cuffey was the son of Kofi Slocum, a freed Ashanti slave, and a Wampanoag Indian woman. Paul was a wealthy businessman, a ship owner, and a sea captain who had somehow been involved in the British effort in Sierra Leone. Unfortunately, Paul Cuffey died 2 years after beginning this important endeavor. The American Colonization Society, however, picked up where he had stopped and mobilized another 86 black men and women along with 3 white agents of the ACS. They set sail from New York on board the Elizabeth on February 6, 1820, and landed on Chebro Island on March 9, 1820. Unfortunately, Chebro Island was no sanctuary. It was a death zone. Within months, all 3 white agents and more than half of the settlers were dead from malaria and other tropical diseases. To complicate issues further, the land was low-lying and lacked sufficient fresh drinking water. In addition, the natives living there refused to sell their land to the settlers. The search for a suitable alternative took them further east to Cape Mesurado, where they were able to negotiate a settlement. We use the word negotiate loosely because there is still an intense debate about what went down that day. Some call it outright armed robbery, others call it pistol diplomacy. It was something like an American naval officer putting his handgun to the head of King Zolu Duma and saying, "Hey, African, your land or your life." Well, maybe not like that. Some say he just raised his handgun in the air and did not point it at anyone in particular. Well, let's just say Captain Robert Stockton was a very persuasive negotiator. He managed to purchase roughly 140 acres of land, including Cape Mesurado and Providence Island, with all kinds of items valued at about 300 United States dollars, about 8,000 US dollars in today's money. The deal was sealed by the Ducour contract. The survivors from Chebro Island were relocated there in April 1822. Unfortunately, by November of that year, the African chiefs wanted their land back. They waited for Stockton to leave, then, bam, they attacked. From their point of view, the Ducour contract was a lease agreement, not a sales invoice. They wanted the settlers living on their land to be subjected to the authority of the tribal ruler here, like their other native subjects. The settlers saw it the other way around. They had no intention to comply. They had not traveled 4,000 miles across the sea to be subjugated by tribal chiefs. The indigenous inhabitants, on the other hand, were resolved to take back what they thought was rightfully theirs. The fault lines were no more hidden. It was only a matter of time before they erupted. It was a calm morning. In fact, too calm. It was as if the leaves of the forest knew. They had stopped rustling. The settlers had not lost their guards, though. The menacing beats of the tribal drums many nights before, and the blazing fire they could see from miles away had kept them eyeing their surroundings suspiciously. Elijah Johnson, an ex-serviceman from the U.S. military, had organized the men days before and told them to keep alert. Still, today did not seem like the day on which the natives would make trouble. They were wrong. The forest sprang to life. Painted warriors soon overwhelmed the new settlement with blood-curdling screams and stubborn drum beats that kept getting louder. Soon the spears and machete flashed in the morning sun. The settlers were outnumbered. They had nowhere to run except to the low hills behind them. They fought bravely, but it was evident that they could not hold much longer. Just when the fighting was about to turn into an annihilation, something seemed to confuse the tribal warriors. They broke formation and ran. Something mysterious may have intervened in favor of the settlers that day. Whatever it was, inspired a whole myth around the event. Some say a certain woman called Matilda Newport was smoking her pipe and was suddenly inspired to drop the cinder into a loaded cannon. The legend has it that the cannon went off kaboom and gave the native warriors such a terrible fright. It was a pitiful sight to see. Africa did not receive its own. It tried to kill them, but they fought back. Some settlers died that day defending their new country, but more native warriors died protecting their way of life. We don't know the names of the dead, a mix of heroes and villains, depending on which side of the divide you stand. The seed of the Congo native divide was sown in blood that day. But must there be a divide? Where is the one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all? Years later, the government honored Matilda Newport with her own national holiday and a street named after her. Then some other people said, "What? You mean in the middle of such a horrible battle she was calmly smoking a pipe?" It sounded kind of ludicrous, so the government took back everything from her. Poor Matilda Newport. 2 days of intense battle, dubbed the Battle of Crown Hill, fought on November 10th and 11th, 1822, became the first major armed conflict between the American settlers and a coalition of indigenous tribes, primarily the Day, Vai, and Mamban Basas. Unfortunately, it was not the last. Matilda Newport's honor was partially bestowed on King Sao Boso, a native king who believed that peace with the settlers was a better path than a confrontation. Sao Boso spoke of peace with a sword that had once before dripped with the blood of King George, another native king. Sao Boso's peace instrument was his sword. He threatened to behead the natives if they made trouble for the settlers. It was a temporary relief, but the relationship got more complicated. More people kept coming. More settlers came from the west of the Atlantic, USA, and the Caribbean, especially Barbados. The architecture of the demographics drastically changed. Liberia was chosen as the dumping ground for slaves who were captured on the seas during naval enforcement of the ban on the slave trade. These were native Africans, but they came from many different parts of the West African coast that later acquired the following names: Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, Ghana, Togo, Benin, Nigeria, the Congo, etc. They had not been exposed to the Western lifestyle like the settlers who came from across the sea. They formed a layer in the social stratification in the Liberian caste system. They were placed above the indigenous natives and grouped under the term Congo. This nomenclature was later expanded to include all non-indigenous Liberians, complicating the identity politics that has stifled the nation. The settlers were proud to find a place they could call their country, a place where they could write their own narrative and control their own destiny. However, the odds stacked against them were humongous. Relationship challenges with the indigenous inhabitants were a major hurdle, but there were a lot more they needed to overcome to survive in this new land. Settlers arriving from the United States encountered a tropical climate and diseases such as malaria and yellow fever, which caused extremely high mortality rates. Many ACS reports and letters describe entire groups of settlers becoming incapacitated within weeks of arrival. The climate and geography of the land showed no mercy. The settlers struggled to adapt to unfamiliar weather patterns, dense forests, and coastal swamps. ACS correspondence often mentions difficulties clearing land, building shelters, and securing clean water. In addition, the colony was challenged by the important issue of governance. There was a lack of clarity as the ACS attempted to govern the colony from the United States. This led to confusion and resentment as it eroded the hope of self-determination. The prospect of being their own masters was one of the motivating forces behind the desire of the settlers to come to Africa. The fact that the ACS wanted to remotely control their lives led to settlers' debates about leadership, citizenship, and the role of the ACS among the settlers. The ensuing tension contributed to the eventual Declaration of Independence in 1847. Among the litany of problems bombarding the pioneers was economic hardship. Early settlers faced shortages of food, tools, and supplies. The colony struggled to establish a stable agriculture and trade. Financial instability, which persisted even after independence. For Liberia to become a nation, wars were fought and sacrifices made on both sides of the social spectrum. Nothing came on a silver platter. Much had to be done before this dream could become a reality. The ground had to be cleared, buildings erected, and farms planted. Some sort of economic system had to be worked out, and a form of government established. Battles had to be fought and compromises made. The settlers and the natives all suffered as a result of the collision of culture. It was all the birth pain of a nation. Unfortunately, that nation, Liberia, is 178 years old, but still struggles with fundamental issues. The quest to understand what went wrong has in itself become incomprehensible as the people and their leaders continue to make the same mistakes that have defined this country over time. So it becomes clear that our problem has not been the fact that mistakes were made, it was the unwillingness or inability to reassess and change course. If you have come with us this far, I would implore you to ponder this question. Why do Liberia and Haiti still struggle with abject poverty after many years of self-rule? These are two countries that were blessed with the opportunity to demonstrate that self-determination by Black men, especially those previously enslaved, was possible. Is their failure an affirmation of the slave driver's belief that the Black man is incapable of self-governance, or a product of someone's desire to facilitate such proof? Think about it. The failure of Haiti, Liberia, and by extension, Black Africa, is something that demands the attention of all Black men, both on the continent and in the diaspora. If you enjoyed this video, like, subscribe, follow, and comment to support what we do.